Hello, class. Professor Mandeville back. As promised, first gentleman I'm going to talk about today is Booker T. Washington. Now, Booker T. Washington is a pioneer in black higher education. In 1881, Booker T. Washington established the Tuskegee Institute down in Alabama with a mere 40 students attending trade school type classes in 4 rundown buildings. And in a short period of 19 years, by 1900, the Tuskegee Institute will be a state-of-the-art institution, and not only will it just have trade programs, it will have higher education programs, and it'll have more than 46 state-of-the-art buildings with 1,400 students attending there yearly. Now, the way that Booker T. Washington is going to be able to build this miraculous institution is, believe it or not, he will raise the money to build the Tuskegee Institute from Southern white Americans. Now, you might wonder, why in the world would Southern whites give a black man like Booker T. Washington money to build an all-black first trade school and an institution of higher education? Well, Booker T. Washington was a fantastic fundraiser. And he used to go around and speak to groups of wealthy Southern whites, and he'd talk about his theory of society that he called gradualism. Now, with gradualism, as he explained it to these potential donors, he used to use the metaphor of the ladder. And he talked about how, for example, in the 1880s, 1890s, society was in 2 very different places. White society was way up here on the social ladder. African American society, recently being freed from slavery, was way down here. He envisioned a world where both groups would be equal. But he said it's going to be a slow, gradual, as in the name gradualism, process. And that African Americans would slowly climb this ladder in society until they reach the same plateau as white America. And what would allow them to climb that ladder of society? Education. Who's going to provide it to them? Booker T. Washington and the Tuskegee Institute. Now, what wealthy white Southerners liked so much about Washington's message was the gradual part of it. They were not in favor of instantaneous equality, and it was very attractive to them that, as Washington would put it, be a slow, gradual climb up the ladder. And as far as a lot of these wealthy white Southerners were concerned, it probably would never happen in their lifetime. So, they gave money to Booker T. Washington for this gradual process of equality. Now, we can't mention the Tuskegee Institute without mentioning their most famous and important professor, and that's Professor George Washington Carver. Now, no doubt you've heard of him before, and he's very famous for his experiments related to the cultivation of peanuts, and really put the peanut crop on the map in the South, which is a huge cash crop today, and came up with all sorts of uses for the peanut. But what he doesn't really get credit for, and is to the world way more important than a peanut, that's his groundbreaking research in soybean cultivation. Soybeans are the largest source of protein for the world's citizens today. A large number of people in the world do not get their protein from meat products. They get it from soybeans. And it's Booker T. Washington who did the groundbreaking research, came up with the proper plants, and promoted it and really put soybeans on the map. So we can thank him for helping to feed the entire world. So, that's Booker T. Washington. The next person I want to talk to you about today is a personal hero of mine, somebody I greatly admire, and I think he's one of the greatest Americans ever. And unfortunately, there's a lot of Americans who don't know much about him, and some haven't even ever heard his name before. And that's the great W.E.B. Dubois. Now, sometimes you'll read about Dubois because he and Booker T. Washington were rivals in theories, and Booker T's gradualism didn't sit very well with Dubois, and they argued a lot about that. But obviously they both had the same purpose, and that was equality. So I want to tell you about W.E.B. Du Bois' amazing life. So, he was born before the Civil War, I think slightly after. I think he was born in he was born in 1868, in Great Barrington, Massachusetts, which is a little city located in the Berkshire Mountains of Western Mass. Now, the Berkshire Mountains were very similar to the Finger Lakes region of New York. They were a hotbed for the abolitionist movement. And so, having accomplished their goal, the abolitionists, still, they were very committed to equality. Similar to the Finger Lakes, fighting for the equality of African Americans and then of women and so forth. So he grew up in a city where basically there was no prejudice or racism. And he was very lucky to grow up in Great Barrington. He was the child of a single mom who worked very hard to provide for her children. And Du Bois went to high school because he was lucky enough to grow up in the period when public high schools became a reality. And he was a brilliant student in high school. In fact, his high school principal recognized his ability, and he got to know Du Bois pretty well and knew that if something wasn't done, this brilliant young man was going to be more or less an educational waste. Because he knew that Du Bois' single mom could not afford to send him to college, and that this kid was brilliant. In fact, he'll graduate from the Great Barrington High School, valedictorian of the class. So, the principal will do a fundraiser in Great Barrington to raise funds to send Du Bois off to college. So, thanks to his high school principal, Du Bois, after graduating as valedictorian in his high school, will go off to start his higher education career, attending Fisk University in the state of Tennessee. Fisk is a historical black college and university. Now, when Du Bois gets to Fisk University, in his memoirs, he writes about what a different world Tennessee was. And he really has his very first experiences with racism, because he grew up in a non-racist place in the Berkshire Mountains. And in his memoirs, he recalls, shortly after he was on campus, he and a couple of his roommates were walking into town to do something, buy groceries, have lunch, whatever. And they're walking down the street, and all of a sudden his two companions dart across the street. And he's kind of puzzled by it. He quickly runs behind him and says, "Hey, what are you doing? Where are you going?" "The place we're headed to is on the other side of the street." And his two companions, who were from the south, said, "Didn't you see who was walking towards us?" And Dubois said, "Yes, there was a man walking towards us." And they said, "It's a white man. Black men don't walk on the same side of the street as white men do. That's why we crossed the street." Dubois was shocked. This really brought it home to him, something he'd only read about in books, what racism was all about. He remembers going back to his dorm room that night and unfortunately crying himself to sleep. This was a pretty shocking incident for the young man. But obviously he'll get through it. He'll spend a couple years at Fisk University. He'll do so well there that he'll be noticed by his professors, and he'll transfer to Harvard University, where he will excel and get his bachelor's degree at Harvard. After graduating from Harvard, he will start his graduate studies over in Europe. He'll get a scholarship to attend the University of Berlin. While at Berlin, he starts being exposed to some groundbreaking disciplines that were happening at the time. The time that Du Bois is going to college in the 1890s is when the so-called social sciences are all just brand new fledgling studies. Things like psychology becomes a discipline with psychology departments at universities. Other things that Du Bois will excel in, sociology becomes a discipline, and colleges and universities start to develop departments in sociology. Study of government becomes known as political science, and so forth. So, while in Berlin earning his master's degree, that's where Du Bois figures out what he wants to do with his life. He wants to be a sociologist. So, he applies to Harvard for a fellowship at Harvard University in the brand new discipline of sociology. Harvard University is one of the few universities in the United States, in the world for that matter, that is offering PhDs in sociology at this point in history. So, he will get a fellowship, which a fellowship means that's a free ride through grad school. Typically, you act as a teaching assistant, you teach a few courses, you assist professors and so forth, and in exchange for that, they give you a free education, you earn your PhD. So, Du Bois goes to Harvard. There was some confusion in the beginning of who he was. They thought, mistakenly, that he was Dubois, the Frenchman from Europe, but that was all settled. And Du Bois does very well. He'll graduate at the top of his class, and he will be the first black man to receive a PhD from Harvard University. Quite an accomplishment for him. Now, upon his graduation, he sees all of his fellow classmates, the PhDs in sociology, going off and getting great jobs. Many of them were hired by universities across the United States to go and start sociology programs. Most universities didn't even have them, so who better to start the entire department than a Harvard PhD? So he sees all of his pals get all these great jobs. He goes off and interviews. He can't find a job. He knows the reason why. The color of his skin. Finally, he has to take a very low-paying job at a pretty prestigious university, University of Pennsylvania, which also has a sociology program. But he has to take a job as an assistant lecturer and researcher, where he's seeing his colleagues go off and be hired by universities as department chairs. So, this ends up being another lucky break for Dubois. This guy, a lot of it, as the Italians say, as my great-grandfather used to say, it's fortuna. It's fate. The project that he is assigned to at the University of Pennsylvania in his research activities is studying crime in Philadelphia. And he does a groundbreaking study on crime comparing the slums to middle-class suburbs in Philadelphia. And he puts this all together in his very first book entitled The Philadelphia Negro, which he publishes in 1898. In this book, he makes a landmark discovery in sociology. He discovers that the environment that somebody grows up in has a tremendous amount of effect on their behavior. And he does this by studying crime in the slums, where he studies and sees poor children being arrested for stealing food from grocery stores. And in middle-class neighborhoods, there's nobody being arrested for stealing food from a grocery store. Wouldn't even pass through a teenager's mind. And he really keys in on these juveniles, who we call today juvenile delinquents, I suppose, and sees the cause of the environment you grow up in, a poor, scraping for everything, affecting your behavior, and unfortunately turning some young people into early criminals. Groundbreaking research. This is really why Dubois is considered one of the fathers of sociology. No doubt, if you have had a sociology class, you must have studied Dubois. I would hope so, anyway. So, his other, his next book that he'll write that'll really make him famous, he'll publish in 1903. And this is really sort of a rebuttal to Booker T. Washington's gradualism. And the title of this famous book is The Souls of Black Folk, published in 1903. Now, once the college is up and running again, go to the library. I had the library buy the 100th anniversary copy of this book in 2003. So we have a copy of it. It's a tremendous book. This book focuses in on equality and equal rights for African Americans. And in this book, Du Bois writes about how he can't buy into the idea of gradualism. He more or less says, how long are we supposed to wait? We were slaves for centuries. We've been freed since 1865, and now it's the 20th century, and nothing's happened. We're still second-class citizens. So what he does in this book, he also tries to encourage his race to get the highest level of education that you possibly can. If it's a high school diploma, it's a high school diploma. If it's a PhD like him, it's a PhD. Because he argues that the more educated African Americans there are, the faster their rise to equality will happen, which obviously Booker T. Washington agrees with, just on different terms. And he also makes a very poignant point in this book that stuck with me my entire life. And he talks about how your education, mine, yours that you're working on, is something that belongs to just you. My education's mine. I went to college for a long time. I'm still learning every day to teach you guys. That's something that's mine. No one can ever take that away from me. They could throw me in a prison. They could beat me daily, but I'd still have the same education. And I could sit in that prison cell and read books and understand them and continue to learn if I wanted to. And the same goes for all of you. Education is vital, and Du Bois knew it personally. Now, this book, The Souls of Black Folk, becomes a Bible for the civil rights movement. In later lectures, I'll talk to you about how Du Bois founded the NAACP during the Progressive Era, was a pioneer at that point. But the Souls of Black Folk will also be very important in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. Civil rights leaders like Dr. Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, Medgar Evers, Stokely Carmichael will carry around the Souls of Black Folk like a Bible. Also, another group tremendously influenced by the Souls of Black Folk were the Black Panthers, who, up until recently got a really bad rap when J. Edgar Hoover had deemed them to be public enemy number one or whatever the hell he said. Black Panthers did a lot of good in their cities, especially in Oakland. They fed little kids. They had breakfast programs for kids before they went to school. And they always talked about something that was mentioned in the Souls of Black Folk, the talented 10th. That at any given time, there's about 10% of Black Americans who have higher education degrees. And they have an obligation to help pull up the rest of their brothers and sisters. And that goes for everybody. We all need to help people try to achieve the greatest things they can in their lives. And those of us who have higher educations, that's one of our jobs in society. That's why I've committed 30 years of my life to teaching students like you. Now, Du Bois has a very long life. He's going to live to be 97 or 98 years old. It slips my mind right now. So I want to tell you about what happened at the tail end of his life, even though that's jumping way ahead to the 1950s and 60s. Du Bois, in the 1950s, got caught up in some turmoil like a lot of Americans did. In the 1950s, the Second Red Scare was happening, or as some of you may have studied it, McCarthyism. Senator Joe McCarthy from Wisconsin was on this communist witch hunt, claiming the government had been infiltrated, the State Department, this, that, the other thing. Today we know he was a tragic alcoholic who had illusions of grandeur and thought he could be president someday. And in fact, before 1960, he'll drink himself to death. But in the meantime, he'll ruin a lot of people's lives. People in Hollywood and others that he accuses of being commies. Now, someone he also accused of being a communist was W.E.B. Du Bois. And the way it worked was he'd issue subpoenas for them to appear in front of the Committee on Un-American Activities, a joint committee in Congress, where he would grill these people, accuse them of being commies, and try to get them to spill the beans on communists they might know. Well, Du Bois received a subpoena, and he told McCarthy and Congress what they could do with their subpoena. He said, "Go to hell, I'm not coming and testifying. And in fact, I'm so angered by this, I'm going to pack my bags and fulfill one of my lifelong dreams. I'm moving to Africa." So, when Du Bois was in his late 80s, he packed up and moved to Ghana, one of the new free independent nations on the African continent after World War II. Africa was all becoming independent, no longer colonized by European powers. And while living in Africa, many of these brand new countries ended up hiring Dubois to lead a team of researchers and scholars to write the first ever definitive history of the African continent written from a black and African perspective. He'll take this project on when he's in his late 80s, early 90s, and he'll finish it before his death. And it still today is the definitive history of the continent of Africa. He and his panel of experts will put together a 20-some volume set on African history. So that's what Du Bois did in his senior years. So as you can see, he's one of the greatest Americans ever to draw breath. He's one of my heroes, and every American should know about W.E.B. Du Bois. So that's where I'll call her quits for now. I may have another lecture in me. I'll take a break and see. If not, I'll be coming back in tomorrow to do some more. So, everybody, take care. Probably talk to you soon.